Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to our talk. It goes without saying that we're living in a time of general crisis, one which has accelerated the longer-term issue of expat flight in the Gulf. The expats are leaving, and that's bad news for the economy, reads one headline from Bloomberg, warning that Dubai's population is expected to shrink by 10% this year. Another article in El Monitor warns of the long-term implications of the exodus of skilled professionals. While a lot of what has been coming out of Kuwait, most notably their parliament's stated goal of cutting expat numbers to 30%, hints at a conundrum at the heart of migration issues in the region. Even before the pandemic, there have been rumblings about expatriates leaving since at least the 2014 oil slump. And attempts to reverse this have centered around incentivizing long-term residency in the form of long-term visas, such as the 10-year golden visas for a select few. While nothing is written for now, it is likely that these longer-term, less transient forms of expatriation will grow more prominent and pertinent as time goes by, and that is bound to have profound implications for the Gulf expat state of relations. And this is to say nothing of the elephant in the room, the vast numbers of low-skill expatriates and domestic workers who play a critical role in the running of the economy and Khaliji life as we know it. What changes, if any, can they expect in the status quo and with the current model, with its assumption that these workers will always be available and therefore replaceable, hold up in the long term? In tonight's discussion, we aim to examine this changing relationship through social, economic, and political lenses and to ask the open-ended questions that are so often skirted around. Who are the expatriates in the Gulf? Are they simply holders of other nationalities, or would that term constitute the Badoon and the children of female citizens in the Gulf? What would a conceivable social contract between the state and long-term expatriates for whom permanent residency or naturalization may be desirable look like? How will the relationship between expatriates and citizenry in particular change? And how will the latter group respond to this? Without further ado, I now wish to briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Yasar Jarrar, a long-term resident of the UAE who has consulted extensively on governmental and non-governmental projects, who's currently involved with the World Economic Forum, and is the author of the Sheikh CEO about his experience working under the ruler of Dubai. Dr. Neha Vora, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Lafayette College and author of Impossible Citizens, Dubai's Indian Diaspora. His Excellency, Omar Ghobash, former ambassador to Russia and France, author of Letters to a Young Muslim and a veritable titan of cultural diplomacy within the United Arab Emirates, and Eman Alhussein, a Saudi researcher and non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, who's written extensively on issues of migration in the Gulf, particularly since the pandemic has begun. Dr. Vora, when you're ready.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a wonderful topic and it's quite timely, as you mentioned. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give a brief overview of my research and some of the findings in my research, and then move into a couple of points that relate to like what's going on right now. So basically, I am an anthropologist. I have done extensive research in the Gulf, mainly in the UAE and in Qatar. The book that was mentioned is Impossible Citizens, is from my dissertation fieldwork turned into a book. And I started that research in 2006, and I continued doing follow-up research in Dubai through 2010 for that work. So it's a bit, now like 10 years in the past. That research was based on looking at Indian communities in the neighborhoods of Old Dubai. So Bur Dubai, Karama, Deira, Sadwa, these communities look even more different now than they did at the time of my research due to gentrification and changes in different kinds of demographics there. But this is where I concentrated most of my research, although the research was pretty much on Indian diaspora in Dubai. So that included working class people, middle class people, wealthy business people, and also many second generation children of immigrants. And I think this is where some of the sticking points come into about who belongs and who doesn't belong or should have permanency in the Gulf, right? I'm sure everybody here is somewhat familiar with the kafala system. That is a sponsorship system that creates a condition of basically permanent temporariness for immigrants and also high precarity. So immigrants are not even referred to as immigrants in the Gulf, right? They're either expatriates or migrant laborers. And that also shows us how the residency system, the employment system is ethno-racial, and it's also classed. So there's a hierarchy of privileges in residency and employment based on a range of things: your class status, the country you come from, your race. I know there's a lot of interesting conversations that are going on right now thinking about what Blackness means in the Gulf also. So it sets up this idea that immigrants do not belong because of the way that the system is regulated, right? There's very little to none access to permanent residency or naturalization for immigrants. This is intensified by schooling and housing policies that produce segregation between citizens and immigrants and between different immigrant groups. So most often immigrants have to go to private schooling. That's not the case in all the Gulf countries and not for all national backgrounds, but most often they have to go to private schooling, and that private schooling often breaks down by nationality or region or language. But what I found in my research, which was basically interviews and hanging out and following around different Indian diasporic people and attending community events, is that despite this system that's designed to prevent belonging, there are vibrant diaspora communities in the Gulf, and particularly South Asian cultures, as we know, have a strong presence and impact on Gulf societies. So people do feel a sense of attachment to place. This is why my book is called Impossible Citizens. I'm arguing that there's ways that they actually perform and feel citizenship-like things, even though their legal citizenship is impossible. Many of them, for example, preferred the Gulf over India for a number of reasons. They noted health and safety for them and their kids, what it meant to be away from the pressures of extended family. For many Muslims, being away from Islamophobia in India and in an Islamic space was very important. There are more conveniences in the Gulf, right? We don't have issues of electricity or AC or things like that, right? The ability to earn is higher. And they start feeling a sense of being out of place when they return to India. And that's something that makes them feel more disconnected from home countries. And they also noted an attachment to the specific neighborhoods and communities they belong to in Dubai. And they have like a historical memory of the generation before them and being part of the building of Dubai, right? They're staking claims to the building of Dubai. Many immigrants I interviewed had lived in the UAE longer than in their home countries. So they might have been working in the UAE for 40 years, claiming they're going to return home one day, sending money to build a house back home. But really, they've spent the majority of their life in Dubai, and Dubai is their home. And their children, especially, don't know anything but the UAE as home. They were even more attached to place. They often expressed that they would never want to live in India, and they faced increasing uncertainty as they got closer to adulthood. Children cannot stay on their parents' visas past the age of 18 for young men and until marriage for young women. Although that does change a little bit, and that was changing when I was doing my research with the influx of all of these private universities and particularly branch campuses into the Gulf region. So what I noted was that a lot of the children of middle and upper middle class Indian immigrants were attending schools like American University of Sharjah, for example. This can extend the time children can stay in the Gulf. So they can now stay in the Gulf until the end of their college. But even more importantly, it allowed for more meaningful interactions and friendships with UAE nationals and other immigrant groups. So they're coming out of highly segregated K through 12 and childhood experiences. And now all of a sudden they're in these like multinational spaces where everybody is supposedly equal and they're interacting on a supposedly, common footing. This also increases attachment to place. And not just for immigrant children, but also for nationals. Nationals get to meet people from different groups that are their peers in ways that they might not have had a chance to do before. So the preferences among these college students that I interviewed were often to work and or marry in the Gulf in order for them to stay, because they didn't really think of their futures in other places, or some of them also take over family businesses. Now, even though the overarching rhetoric that comes out of Gulf governance is that immigrants don't belong, right? if we actually scratch under the surface a little bit, Gulf governments do provide some kinds of social services for non-citizens. They make some rhetorical gestures to belonging through National Day and other kinds of multicultural messaging, especially if you look at the kind of advertising that comes out around like the Dubai Shopping Festival and things like that, right? These things are geared not just to nationals, they're also geared to immigrant populations. The allowance for the purchase of freehold property was a big thing when I was doing my initial research. That allows someone to get a 99-year visa, so they're effectively a permanent resident. There are some, but very limited numbers of naturalizations. And now we also have the golden visa, which is basically a green card type thing for the uber wealthy. But these are, as you can see, highly classed. And sometimes they also rely on having some kind of wasta. So my following research project after doing research in Dubai was in Doha's Education City. The reason I went there is because I was seeing all of these international campuses come into the Gulf and really seeing this impact that it had on the second generation that I had studied in Dubai, and wondering, okay, you know, a place like Qatar has brought in many institutions into one place. It seemed like a really good place to understand, you know, what kinds of impacts foreign branch campuses were having on young people and then therefore on Qatari futures. So in the Education City schools, this is research I conducted between 2010 and 2014. The book that came out of this is called Teach for Arabia. It came out in 2018, sorry. So in Education City schools, there's like 5 or 6 American branch campuses. Now there's also local institutions. There's a British institution. There's a bunch of different higher education institutions in Education City. While there is a lot of segregation between Qataris and non-Qataris on the campuses, I found that there's also a lot of shared communities and politicizations between different students, similarly to what I had seen in Dubai, but even more intensified. This, to me, was creating a sense of Qatari national identity as one that did include certain immigrants, namely those who are more elite and have a longer term presence in the country. So Qatar's immigration policies and, you know, mainstream government attitudes towards immigrants are almost identical to the UAE's. They have a similar kafala system structure, similar kinds of restrictions on mobility and visas and things like that. So in Qatar, immigrants are also permanently temporary and precarious. However, what I did see that was different from when I was in the UAE to this project was that there was a very intensified multicultural messaging. So for example, the last year that I was doing research in 2014, the National Day celebrations in Qatar, where the tagline was called One Love, and there was like 2 hands making a heart. One was darker and one was lighter. It was very clearly saying that, you know, this is a country full of many different kinds of people and they all should be celebrating National Day and they all belong in certain kinds of ways, right? So this kind of messaging is prominent. There's also, though, structural ways that immigrants are increasingly included in the Gulf states. So for example, in Education City, everybody had access to financial aid and to loans as well as grants. And even more importantly, the financial aid, if you took it out in loans, if you worked in Qatar for a certain amount of years, so I think 4 to 5 years, your entire financial aid will be forgiven. So we can see how this is actually a system, unlike what the government claims, which is that knowledge economy development is meant to reduce the number of expatriates in the country. This is a system of employment and higher education that is encouraging immigrants to stay on in the country and contribute after they get their degrees. There were also quote systems, for example, for scholarships, for example, that took into account.
Dr. Vora, we've run out of time for you, I'm afraid. But thank you for your comments. They were very insightful in just getting an idea of how, you know, the expat communities within Dubai view each other, the different government tactics, I guess, government strategies at, you know, on the one hand, putting out the message that we are a national community, they are temporary, but on the other hand, finding ways, you know, even then of incentivizing them to stay, and I feel this will grow more prominent. Dr. Jarrar, please feel free to...
Thank you, Khaleefa, and good evening, everyone. At least those in the region, good evening. It's good afternoon or late evening for you in the UK. So I will make some comments now to argue for and against my own case. So let me see how this goes, because it's a very complex situation. I don't think this is a 0-1 situation, because what the situation we find ourselves in the Gulf now has grown organically over the past 50 years. And now things like COVID come every now and then and shock the system to the core and give us the opportunity to ask some very fundamental questions. And I will take the topic of permanent guests from a public policy point of view. So I will put myself in the place of a government who's trying to tackle this situation. And I have to argue to say that, you know, these permanent guests we're looking at in the GCC, I am one of them. And I'm talking about the whole GCC, so I will probably give examples from different countries, but I am talking about the whole of the GCC. They are the worst of guests and they're the best of guests. So there's a lot of things going for these guests, and there's a lot of things we have to consider about the guests being there. So in terms of longevity and in terms of permanency, my initial starting point is it's a definite maybe, right? And it's going to be for some it's a matter of when, not if, because of the sustainability of the development model. There's something about development models. Keep in mind that we're talking about a region that has a majority of the labor force in the private sector expatriates. So this is very fundamental for the economy. This hasn't been done anywhere else before, either by history or by geography. So this is a very unique experiment at that. And I use the word experiment because I don't think we have finally found out the final bits of the formula. But my point is, at the beginning, at this point in time, it's a very sensitive topic to talk about permanency, in the sense that our labor markets are a bit of a mess. And I'll explain what I mean by a mess. So if we offer the opportunities now for long-term residencies based on different angles, different lenses, human rights, whether it's international law point of view, whatever you want to call it, we will be hardwiring a bit of a messy labor market. We have very unproductive labor markets. We have the highest levels of public sector wage bills across the whole world, in the Arab world and in the GCC. We haven't invested in technology, fundamentally because of the availability of cheap labor that was almost endless, and like you said, Khaleefa, available and replaceable. So we haven't invested in raising productivity. And in other places in the world, you don't find so much labor available to take away your everyday parts of life. You know, you walk into a petrol station where you live, Khaleefa, or you study in the UK, you probably find one attendant. You will find 12 in the same petrol station, serving the same number of cars. So there's a fundamental issue of productivity. The current labor markets need to be re-looked at before we even start thinking about making these permanent structures in the labor market. So this is from a labor market point of view. So we have to fix them. That's my first point. My second point is, we're making the assumption that everybody does want to stay. And there's a difference in terms of the expats that come here. There's a difference between Asian expats, Arab expats. There's a whole bunch of African expats. So there's many levels. And I have to say two things. I'm going to give you some thoughts from an economic lens, from a social lens, and then from probably an international relations lens. But the COVID-19 crisis came and made us all ask fundamental questions. Some countries, we've heard screams in social media, and then it spilled over to mainstream media, something along the lines of get them out. You know, these expatriates are taking places in hospitals, they're overcrowding our hospitals. We've heard the equally loud voices from the Gulf saying, we want them, keep them in. They're important for the economy, they hold strategic jobs, some of them are doctors. I was very heartened living in the UAE, many occasions when His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed came out to the public and talked about the locals and the residents, and he mentioned the words Ahlna. He mentioned the word La Tshillunham. So he used words to say that we are one community. And that was extremely important tone in terms of the dimension of where this is going, whatever the nature of the residency was. So let me make some comments about how complex this is. When you look at the relationship at the moment between people who live here as residents, and as I said, the COVID crisis has been very pressurizing for everybody. I think there's people in the UAE, residents, expatriates that I talked to who didn't want to go back home. They were extremely pleased, as I said, like I did when we heard in the UAE leadership talking about this is everybody's home. We're looking after every single person here. So many people who had the choice didn't want to leave. So that talks about some of the stickiness that maybe Dr. Neha mentioned about people feel like this is home. But this is a very transactional relationship. Despite the feeling that this is still home, it's transactional in the sense that the governments in the last 5 years, since the oil prices dropped across the whole GCC, started looking at things, started looking at the expatriates as well as for their utilities in terms of paying taxes, paying fees. We have to also mention the big elephant in the room that nobody pays taxes here. We pay for fees. We probably generate some revenue, but there's no taxation. And without taxation, you cannot even start to discuss the longer term residency issues, in my view, because that comes with a lot of social benefits that have to be catered for. But it might be a time to recalibrate the relationship now, not in terms of managing a crisis, but if we look at the economy, they're extremely important, like you said, Khaleefa. If they leave now, if we hear that 1 million people are leaving Saudi, a couple of 100,000 people leaving Oman, these are going to take out a certain spending power from the economy, and that will be a hit that can be recovered nonetheless, but it's a hit. Some of them will have strategic jobs, and we have to think very carefully from an economic point of view. If we have doctors, air traffic controllers, people who manage some certain factories, these are strategic jobs that if I was in the government, I wouldn't want to lose, irrespective of the nature of the relationship. Some of the most well-known unicorns in the UAE have been set up by expatriates, Kareem, Souk, Media.net, billions of dollars raised, albeit not all of them probably came to our stock markets, but there's an economic utility. Having said that, there's also this brain drain. A lot of them use the region as a point of departure. I think at one point the UAE was the 9th source of immigration to Canada. I'm sure not Emiratis of my friends immigrated to Canada. So that means somebody else is coming here, setting up shop, getting some experience, and then moving on. And that is not very healthy in terms of knowledge. This is still a form of brain drain. This is experience gained here, and we're losing it. When you look at the cash flight, the remittances, it's huge, in the billions, in the hundreds of billions, the remittances that go out annually. And then when it comes to social safety nets, when something like COVID hits, despite His Highness's assurances, it's a huge drain because, again, there's no taxation, there's no money flowing in directly into the system. So you cannot always rely on the state to carry a group of people who are effectively on a transactional contract here, not so much more. And there's, of course, the pressure that this large number, an inflated number, puts on the resources that are limited. We have issues with the water, we have issues with emissions and structure. So economically, they have a lot of value and utility, but there's a lot of pressure from the expatriates. If I look at the government from the social side, there's a big issue coming up socially, and Dr. Neha mentioned it. When you look at the second generation, I wouldn't have worried much about the first generation. They came on a certain deal. The second generation were effectively handed the deal. So they were told that they're born here, they live here, and that's a trickier situation, which is just emerging now. That second generation is just coming into the workforce. They bring a lot of diversity. I'm one of those people who think that the more diverse a classroom is, the better, whether I'm teaching it or attending it. But also, if you look at the pressure, especially with the Asian percentages and the language differences, the numbers are skewed. So there's a big loss or potential loss of identity, of the Arabic language, and that has to be catered for as well, because it could be a very quick Singapore situation where they said the official language of Singapore is English. That caused an uproar. Lee Kuan Yew had to manage it extremely sensitively and sometimes in a very powerful manner. But here's the issue for me socially, and I always say this in my chats and talks: nobody ever cleans a rented car. And that for me is a fundamental psychological issue. If the relationship is transactional and remains transactional, it is very difficult for 50% or more of our populations to worry about the future. So if we want people to preserve energy, to preserve water, to behave in a more sustainable manner, if the relationship is transactional, that message doesn't filter through. And that for me is a very tricky part of this equation that has to be taken into consideration. And then there's the international relations part, which is, we have we have diaspora, sort of expatriates from large emerging economies. We've got India, China's growing, Africa, Pakistan, and these links have proved very good for the UAE, for Saudi, for Kuwait, in terms of economically. But let me ask you a question. What about imported problems? What if a problem happens between China and India, and then we're asked to choose sides within the community, or China and India and Pakistan? So there's a lot of imported problems that I would say, if people still feel they belong elsewhere, they will import the problems that they bring out from elsewhere. So closing notes, Khaleefa, I know I've overstayed my welcome. First of all, I think in the GCC, we're past the point of no return, in the sense that we can't sit here now really logically discussing should we or shouldn't we. We've passed that point. It's a matter of how best can we deal with this issue of permanency or longer term. It's how best can we deal from a productivity of a labor market, from preserving our culture and society, from the economic benefit, but also from the social safety net and all the challenges this will bring. We've had the back and forth between the property issues.
Stop you there. You've run out of time. Thank you for that. That was incredibly insightful, especially you gave a good overview of the economic perspective. Before we move on to our next speaker, I'd like to give Dr. Vora an opportunity to comment on what Dr. Jarrar has said, and likewise for you to respond to Dr. Vora.
I think and I'm also paying attention to some of the Q&As that are coming in.
Just to clarify one thing, apologies for not making this clear at the start. There will be a separate Q&A session once we've gotten through all the speakers. They will be free to discuss, the questions which you send in. We are keeping track of the questions, so don't worry about that. We will get to the Q&A.
Okay. I don't really have any direct response right now. I'd like to hear the rest of the comments, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. In that case, moving on, Your Excellency, if you'd like to give your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. I found both of the
sorry, we can't hear you clearly. I think there are issues.
You can't? Oh, 1 second.
Yeah, that's
Is that better?
Yeah.
All right, then I'm going to have to lean over to my computer. I've really enjoyed what both of the speakers have said so far. I was hoping to hear the end of what they both had to say, because I'm sure that there were going to be some important conclusions that were going to assist me in perhaps providing a bit of a defense for the situation in the Gulf. I speak, as an Emirati, and as an Emirati who is of a foreign mother. So my mother is Russian, and so I've grown up with all of these questions of identity and belonging. Only to discover that actually having the nationality and the passport doesn't solve any of that, and that you can still feel that you're a temporary, transient, precarious, you're living a precarious existence, even if you are, right there at the heart of the Medjlis. I've also, I'm not really going to touch on the economic aspects of this question, but I will look at the origins of the Emirates. And the origins of the Emirates, I don't think we ever claimed that we were a melting pot, and I don't think we ever claimed that we were going to build the Emirates on the issue of belonging for all. It was a much more dire situation than that, and it was a question of the survival of the Emirates as a set of independent units. Under one government. I think Dr. Yasar has pointed out that there was a transactional relationship that was proposed, and in a sense, we don't feel that we've been given any credit for actually having lived up to that. It sounds like it may have been in our better interest to bring in people on 2-year visas and then never let them come back again, rather than allow them to develop a sense of belonging and a sense of desire to stay and all. But in fact, what we did was we said, okay, you've been here, we recognize that you're part of our community. We are all actually in a community where we interact with each other and affect each other. And therefore, we're going to respect that about you, and we're going to allow you to stay for 30 years if so. So, I don't think that we see that the expat gets, the short end of the stick here. We actually think that we're giving an incredibly good deal, and we are in return receiving an incredibly good deal as well. And so this idea that, you know, the system was built to prevent belonging. Belonging is an incredibly emotional and emotive word. I find it very difficult to get into discussions around that sense, given that I know so many Emiratis who also have questions about belonging. We come from different emirates, we come from different tribes, we come from different colors. You know, I have spoken to Emiratis who are half Indian, and they face a much more difficult time than somebody like me who is half Russian. So all of these issues are right across the board. One thing I will say is that, particularly in the last few years, there has been a very, very concerted effort at the level of government to make it exceptionally clear that what was permissible in the past, in the early 2000s and the late 1990s, i.e. the discussion about foreigners taking away our jobs, foreigners expanding into our country, foreigners, you know, using up our resources, was no longer going to be accepted. And in fact, there has been a very, very concerted effort to change the perception of expats within the Emirati community, that actually we owe expats a tremendous amount. We don't ask what expats owe us. We owe expats a tremendous amount. Our economy depends on the presence of expats here. Many of the services that we now take for granted are because expats are here. And that's why there's been this very big push in terms of tolerance, in terms of openness around religion, in terms of making sure that in the public rhetoric around, say, for example, COVID, that there is repeated reference to Emiratis, citizens, and residents. And in fact, pushing it even further to actually provide the medical facilities to all without exclusion. So I agree that you can take a very kind of critical, you can bring a critical analysis to the situation without necessarily getting a sense of where the Emirati is coming from. But I would say that, you know, you have to see it from both sides. And then I yield my time back to the doctors and to Eman.
You've actually finished early, so I mean...
That's why I yield my time.
Dr. Jarrar, would you like to comment on what His Excellency has said, or will we be moving on?
Let me first unmute myself and then make one comment on what His Excellency said. So I fully agree in the sense that the relationship has been very clear in terms of the state and the expat and the nationals, and it was a very finely balanced relationship. I think from my point of argument here is not in any way, shape or form anybody owing anything to anybody else. It's a matter of structural economics and development models. So my point here is, at one point, for the development model and the sustainability, and as I said, that's my angle to this public policy, I think it is going to be a matter of time before we see something along the lines of a point-based system that will support certain things happening more permanently. Because I personally live in Dubai, I plan to be in Dubai and the UAE for some time, and I want some surgeons to be here forever, right? I want my family doctor to be here forever. But I've also said, if I'm sitting in the government's position, we have built a little bit of in the whole GCC, in Saudi as well, in Oman, we have built unproductive markets. So we have to really think about this from many, many points of view, especially, and if we do start having this conversation, then, you know, permanency or the longer term is not only about visas, it's about rights, it's about taxes, it's about contribution. So I think it's a very complex situation. I think every single country has taken steps toward that. Saudi has a green card system in their Vision 2030. The UAE has a golden visa that is being given out. And I think that's probably the right level of experimenting with this model. I don't think the answer is you know, here's how it works, everybody can come in, or everybody should stay out. I don't think it's a 0-1 situation. So I think it has to be calibrated for the development and sustainability of the gains that have been made.
Okay, Dr. Vora?
Yeah, I think you make some excellent points. I mean, one of the things that I was going to say at the end of my comments was that when I started my research in 2006, migration was a dirty word. I mean, I had people getting angry at me that I was even studying it. And as you mentioned, expatriates are now, you know, mentioned in national development plans. This is kind of what I meant by the multicultural messaging. For me, one of the things that's really important here is advocating for greater legal inclusion opportunities for expatriates, to me is also an advocacy for certain things that citizens are not getting and are not able to do right now. There's an enormous pressure on citizens to conform to one narrow sort of understanding of what national identity means, and to diminish the kind of heterogeneity that you mentioned, and that causes a lot of tensions. I feel like and from the side of scholarship, it's hard for us to even think about these populations as ones that overlap and have things in common. What would it look like if we actually had residents working across ethno-national lines to advocate for a better society for all, right? How do Gulf governments utilize the idea of scarcity and petro benefits to actually keep their citizenry in line in particular kinds of ways? So these are questions I think that are actually quite fundamental to the everyday flourishing of both groups, immigrants and citizens.
Certainly. Your Excellency, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, I wanted to say that there is definitely an interesting effect of foreign residents here. And I remember a few years ago there was you can't hear me, can you? Yeah?
Perfect.
Sorry, it's American technology. What can you do?
My Chinese, Your Excellency, my Chinese.
So there are certain things that foreigners have said here that in a way Emiratis or Gulf Arabs wouldn't have said so straightforwardly. And in a way we kind of ride the general changing atmosphere of debate that allows us to then say, okay, well, you know, that's actually quite a good idea. Why don't we try that? Yeah? And there is a very, very interesting discussion that goes on, perhaps more behind closed doors than in public, around this very narrow sense of identity. And I'm always one of the people who says we have to expand our sense of what it means to be Emirati, because there are, I think it's now 53% of Emirati marriages are mixed marriages, mixed nationality marriages. And so you imagine where that's going to take us in the next 20 years. There is, of the Filipino Emiratis, there are 5,000 half Emirati, half Filipino kids in the Emirates. You know, that's a tremendous resource for us as well. As being, you know, kind of a distortion of our traditional identity. My first language is English. Many Emiratis' first language is English. There are others who speak, you know, a whole host of languages. There's a young Emirati lady who speaks Mandarin fluently because her mother is Chinese. Now, how is that going to have an effect on our sense of identity? At the same time as that, as this increased kind of range of identities is taking place, we also have a push to greater patriotism and a greater return to the traditions of our forefathers. Well, I publicly said I can't do that because my forefathers are Russian. You know, I mean, it's if I went back to their traditions, then I come up looking very different. So I think there is an increased openness to differing identities, and Khaleefa Dhaheri will definitely be leading those calls.
Inshallah, inshallah. Ms. Alhussein, we'll be giving you extra time, so feel free to give, you know, your own speech and then comment on the speakers. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Khaleefa. It was very interesting listening to all of this, and I think many of the points that I wanted to mention have already been discussed, so I hope I won't speak too much. But of course, I'll be looking at this mainly as a Saudi researcher who's been, you know, reading about this and researching it as well. And I think I will look, you know, mostly at the relationship between expatriates and Gulf citizens to better understand the situation we are in right now. So first of all, let me start by saying, as other guests have said, that, you know, expatriates are the backbone of Gulf economy, whether they are highly skilled professionals or low-income workers. Of course, both are very important for countries that are going transformation projects like Saudi Arabia, for example. I think the need for expatriates has become so deeply rooted in our culture that their availability and abundance has always been taken for granted, as you said in your opening remarks. This is why the dual effect of the pandemic and falling oil prices played a key role in foregrounding our relationship with expatriates. And I think despite the lockdown, migrant workers and expatriates in general have become more visible now than any other time before. Visible for those in the Gulf who realized how important they are for the economy, and also visible for others who began seeing expatriates, or perceiving them with increasing concern and worry. I think to better understand the situation, we need to perhaps look at certain Gulf countries that share somewhat common characteristics in this regard. And here I'll be mainly looking at low-wage workers because they constitute a big number of the foreign workforce in the Gulf. In this category, we have Saudi Arabia, where expatriates constitute 1/3 of the population. Kuwait, where citizens are the ones who constitute 1/3 of the population. And Oman and Bahrain, where the numbers or the population is somewhat divided between expatriates and local citizens. Of course, here the demographic and economic concerns were further highlighted by the pandemic. And some of these concerns, as Dr. Yasar mentioned, or Dr. Neha as well, the flaws in the sponsorship system, or Nizam al-Kafala. Of course, this system has allowed many individuals in the Gulf to bring in migrant workers, sometimes not even having to be responsible for them. So they have to come in and they find work for themselves and accommodation as well. And in return, they pay their sponsors a monthly or an annual fee to stay in the country. This created the phenomenon of tijarat ta'shirat, or visa merchants. That is not new. It's been going on for decades, and especially in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And when you see how the poor conditions that they were living in, of course, that makes sense that when the pandemic started, it targeted mainly these expat communities or migrant communities. And that daily health briefings in the Gulf would divide the numbers of new infections between expatriates and the local citizens. And of course, when you have the pandemic among migrant workers in the beginning, the numbers were very high, and that added more to the xenophobia and anxiety. Of course, one of the reasons is that many of these migrant workers are in jobs that require direct contact with locals. And this is why we've seen in Kuwait, for example, grocery stores were they replaced migrant workers with Kuwaiti volunteers. In Saudi Arabia, for example, during the lockdown, when delivery apps were very much in demand, these apps hired Saudi citizens, sometimes even some of them volunteered to deliver the goods. So this also played on the notion of responsibility. And if we've seen how Saudi Arabia used the hashtag, "we are all responsible," so pushing locals to take jobs and step in and so on. So I think one of the things that we've seen also, this issue of responsibility and the roles of citizens that were further highlighted by this pandemic. The other concern is regarding the private sector. Now, the private sector is dependent on expatriates for many reasons. And of course, since we are trying to lessen our dependency on oil, the private sector needs to be revived because it still remains small. And add to that, the salaries of public sector employees make up of, half, if not more, of the state's budget. So it's only logical that you want to push the employment from the public sector into the private sector. But then, of course, with the pandemic and the falling oil prices and the overall economic situation, there are many constraints on the private sector. Add to that, Saudi Arabia, for example, will be introducing a VAT increase starting from tomorrow, and this will further implicate the private sector. And just as the other guests have mentioned, we're trying to, see a reduction of the number of expats. Saudi Arabia promised that they will reduce it by 1.2 million at the end of the year. Kuwait, we've seen many already leave the country. And in Oman, where the economic situation is perhaps the most challenged, we've seen how the government has already started replacing migrant workers with Omani in so many jobs. On the other hand, we have Qatar and the UAE. Of course, the situation is very different, and I think your guests have very much focused on it. But I think They are the most dependent on migrant workers because they have the highest numbers per capita in the region. So the situation is quite different. But I would like to say that I think the UAE was the only country in the Gulf that did not announce the numbers of new infections by dividing that number between foreigners and locals. And I think that was a very positive move because it spared it from the growing hostility we've seen in other Gulf countries. Of course, when it comes to highly skilled professionals, as we've mentioned, the situation is very different. We've seen different schemes that were introduced in Qatar, in Saudi, and in the UAE, but they, of course, target entrepreneurs, wealthy residents, and businesses, and so on. So they are catered for a small segment of this expatriate community. Also, when we look at expatriates, and we tend to divide them between, low-wage workers and highly skilled professionals, but we also tend to forget those in the middle who are, holding normal jobs, who are the owners of SMEs, especially in Dubai, and how they've been affected by this. And I think this is why we've seen the numbers we've seen so many of them leave the country. I will just leave it up to here, and I will just, listen to the other points and perhaps, answer some of the Q&As. So thank you so much for this, Khaleefa.
Thank you for that, Eman. Before we proceed into the Q&As, would any of the other speakers like to comment on Eman's questions? I mean, on Eman's statements, or? Anyone?
Before we go to the comments, and before you ask, I'll just make two very quick comments, one for His Excellency Omar and the other for Iman's discussion. I think, so look, one thing for everybody listening as well, this debate about immigrants, people coming from outside the country, isn't a UAE or a Saudi or a GCC debate. It is raging on across the whole world. The UK, something I wouldn't have imagined, left Europe because of similar debates. Trump stopped work visas to the screams of Googles and the Twitters of the world. In Australia, where my better half comes from, we always have this debate of these immigrants should learn to speak English. In Canada, every year they have a forum about what does it mean to be a Canadian. So just to say, this issue of identity isn't so unique to us. What's so unique to us is the disproportionate number of people who are still transient. The second thing I wanted to say is all my debate, maybe the points I mentioned and something Eman mentioned, I talk about long-term residencies because of the benefits for the development model. I'm not talking about citizenship. I think citizenship is much more personal, much more deep, emotional issue. Even if I was Emirati and I wanted to keep 1,000 people here, or as a non-Emirati, talking about citizenship, I think is a completely different panel and much more contentious. And where I come from originally, that's also very touchy. So I think the long-term residency discussion is what I'm sort of putting on the table here, and not a citizenship per se. That's a whole different ballgame. Just wanted to clarify those points before we see. I see a lot of questions coming in fast, and I'm trying to read fast, but I'm not that fast.
Okay. Can I say, I'm finding there are a couple of...
we can't hear you clearly. We're still having...
Sorry, Khaleefa, I'm going to ask you to supply me with a new computer and microphone. Thank you. I'm noticing that quite a few people are saying that perhaps for citizenship, you need to demonstrate your ability to speak Emirati. I would be disqualified on that basis.
I can speak Emirati.
I actually, when I was doing my research in Education City, I met many Qatari citizens who wouldn't have been able to attend Qatari University because they didn't have the Arabic language skills.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, so this is, this is common. And also, we should also, I think, have a historical knowledge enough to ask the question of whether Hindi and Urdu are Emirati languages. Right? Because the language is not fixed, right? It's something that changes over time. And I would guarantee that more people speak Hindi and Urdu in the UAE than they speak Arabic. So why can't that count as a language?
Yeah.
No, certainly. Have you got any other further points, Dr. Vora?
Oh, I just wanted to comment on Eman's points that I really think we do, you know, because it's the Gulf and because it's such a wealthy place, we tend to not have a critique based on class on any of this, but it's absolutely true that like all of these forms of belonging that the Gulf governments have put into place only apply to the uber wealthy. And I think we really do need to have some kind of redistributive sort of way of thinking about what an ideal future might look like. Because these are the most wealthy countries in the world, even when they're in times of crisis. And this idea that there's a scarcity of resources and that if we, you know, if we expand the citizenry or we expand the number of people that can have access to those resources, that all of a sudden the system is going to fall apart. I don't believe that's true.
Okay. Before we move on into the Q&A more directly, I wanted to ask you a few questions that we have prepared. They should be fairly short. One question I'd like to ask for all of you is kind of building off what Dr. Vora said, I mean, what constitutes native within the Gulf? In, I guess, our imagining of what it means to be a native citizen versus an expatriate, because you did make the valid point that there probably are more people here who speak Urdu and Hindi than Arabic. And, you know, on the one hand, you have the reality. On the other hand, we have this belief that, you know, an Emirati citizen or, you know, the national language of the country is Arabic, even when several Emirati citizens, myself included, can't speak Emirati.
So I can address this just based, you know, being an anthropologist, I can give you an anecdotal, like little vignette. So the first time I was ever in a classroom in the Gulf, I went to Zayed University. I had a friend there who was teaching and invited me to come and speak on my research. And, you know, Zayed University in the UAE is for nationals. I don't even know if non-nationals can attend. But if you look at the demographics of who's in the room, right? It's all women. They're all wearing abaya and shayla, but there's literally nothing that they have in common in terms of the way that they look. They span the spectrum from the whitest person to the blackest person, right? Their facial features showcase the range of different regions that the people who live in the Gulf come from. So to take a moment in time, 1971, and say, from this moment on, everyone is pure Arab, just completely erases the history of the intermingling of people in the Arabian Peninsula for millennia. So I don't know what, I mean, and then on top of that, we have lots of people who we might even call the most indigenous, some of the Bedouin population, who don't even have access to citizenship. So this idea of some kind of nativity or purity is just simply belied by the facts on the ground of who lives there and who has citizenship and what the history of the region is.
Do any of the other speakers have something they'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think, Khaleefa, that's a very good point. What Dr. Neha said is that we in the Gulf are already asking this question, you know, what makes someone, you know, from the Gulf or from Saudi or from Kuwait, we're asking it to citizens themselves. In Saudi Arabia, where we have, you know, increasing nationalism, we've seen this question being asked, for example, to people from the Hijaz region, because, you know, their attire, their traditions are being questioned now. This wasn't the case a few years ago. So I think increasing nationalism that we've seen in the past few years, especially in Saudi and Qatar, is readdressing these questions to citizens themselves. And I think this is going to be quite, you know, it shows us how there are so many multi-layered issues of identity that are emerging now as due to this nationalism. So if we're going to ask these questions also to expatriates, it's going to take us some years to figure out what makes someone Saudi or what makes someone from Qatar before we actually, you know, ask that questions to those who, you know, want to belong to this community. Just wanted to mention that.
Certainly. Dr. Jarrar, Your Excellency, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I'd love to hear some of the questions that you had, the people pitching at, but I wanted to say something about identity. I think I'm not an expert or an anthropologist, so I can't comment on what it means to be a Jordanian myself or an Australian for my wife or an Emirati for that matters. But I can tell you something. there's an eroding identity across the whole world. Globalization has taken a lot. So we might sit here and say, you know, our identity, our Arab nationalism is eroding in Jordan, just to stay away even from here, to give you a conceptual example. But, you know, people who grow up speaking English. My nephew hasn't left Jordan. There isn't 90% people in Jordan speaking English, but he grew up speaking English. So there's an element that about this that is changing globally because of globalization. Our access to technology has nothing to do with the demographic structure we're in. Second of all, if you look at the GCC, I want to flip the discussion to say we stand a great chance being a melting pot for the emerging markets. A good friend of mine who's a researcher in the US, Afshin Molavi, talks about Riga Street in Dubai, representing effectively the emerging markets. He said, where else can you go in the world? You see an African trader, you know, having dinner with a Filipino trader being served by, so I think this is a melting pot. So I think no matter what we talk about in terms of who gets to stay or not, I think the model itself has a life of its own now, and it will continue to grow and it will continue to flourish despite some of these conversations. So all I'm trying to say is elements of this model are sticky and will not go away. And I don't think it's a very straightforward black or white identity discussion. And I just think in terms of development, we have to have a conversation about what's best for everyone, keeping in mind again that a lot of the expatriates come here for a certain transactional benefit from their own personnel, and they want to go back. So we're not talking about everybody here wanting to stay and they're being refused. So I want to make sure as well, many expats come here for a goal, and they set a target for many nationalities. So everything we discussed, I think, is not a 0-1 conversation. It's a very complex system, but I see the Gulf countries making steps towards, you know, untangling the system and having very healthy conversations.
Could I just add one last point?
Yeah.
First of all, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Dr. Vora, on the question of class, if you look at the Emirati community, you can distinguish between different classes, and you'll find actually that a large percent of Emiratis are not well off, are not propertied, are not living in the cities, and they're not well served necessarily in terms of education or medical care. And in terms of language, they are locked in the Arabic language, and that is actually a disadvantage in our globalized economy. So they're actually not they are unable to operate to the full extent that you would want in their own economy. Just wanted to raise that issue.
No, I think that's an excellent point, and that kind of gets to what I was saying, that like there's ways to think about this as something that's of mutual benefit and not citizens versus expats. I think that, and this is something that I talk about in my book on Qatar, is that we see this kind of bifurcation happening in the citizenry, where you have one part of the citizenry that is elite, English educated, so-called secular or cosmopolitan, right? These are the people that are probably participating in this panel, to be honest, right? Not just the people on the panel, but I mean the attendees as well. And then alongside with those, like the kids that I was talking about, the ones that are coming from these wealthy families, they're also going to the international IBCs and stuff like that. They are friends, they're forming friendships with nationals in these colleges and things like that. So what we're seeing is this kind of transnational elite that's emerging in the Gulf that is actually leaving behind a lot of the citizenry. And we didn't even talk about the difference between having a national book and not having a national book and all of that kind of stuff. But absolutely, I think that, but I don't think that we can address wealth disparities in the countries unless we actually start thinking about this as one group of residents, and how do we think about the redistribution of resources?
I believe you've all touched on this in responding to the question, but one of the people, before we start answering directly from the Q&A, one of the people in the chat, Ghaith Abdullah, made a fairly pertinent point that in a way, there's almost a growing disconnect between, as you deemed it, the enlightened debate among the secular elite, so to speak, the Western educated, the higher levels of government, the academics, between this level in which, I guess the government can come to an arrangement with the expatriates more directly. There's a growing disconnect between that level and what a lot of the citizenry are perceiving in a way. I guess, populist sentiments among the citizenry themselves. We have certainly seen examples of this. I guess Kuwait has been the loudest case based off what's been coming out of there. Lots of the controversy and, the parliament's stated aim of cutting the expat, flipping the percentage around. But I mean, I've certainly seen this play out, in the Arabic dialogue, so to speak, between Emiratis, in the Arabic side of things. I guess, in the English-speaking side, we're all aware in a way of our actual relationship to the expatriates. Whereas, when you look at some of the stuff coming out from the Arabic side, there seems to be, in a way, a growing disconnect between the reality and their own perceptions, and kind of not responding, but related to what Dr. Jarrar said about, in a way, a counter to what you said about globalization eroding identity. Wherever you've seen globalization erode identity, there has been a counter movement. There has been a populist reaction. So do you think that populism, ultranationalism, which you've all touched on, is this going to become a greater issue moving forward? Are we going to be able to navigate this? How can we navigate this issue? Oh God.
Khaleefa, you were asking Dr. Jarrar. Excellent.
All of you.
Please, Your Excellency, please do start. It's a complex question. Let me think about it.
Yeah, so I'm going to take the simpler approach. We need to be very, very careful because a lot of the younger leadership is broadly Western educated, cosmopolitan, has lived a life of privilege, and there is this kind of focus on trying to find other smart, young, up and coming, nationals to fill out the ranks. And I think we really need to be very, very careful not to leave behind the larger percentage of, in our case, Emiratis, who are not particularly gifted, who are not particularly, studious, who are not particularly hardworking, who are still operating under the impression that there is a different deal. Essentially the social contract in our country has changed to one where you might expect a certain income, a certain amount of support. It's now moving very, very rapidly to, we are in a globalized economy. We want to actually be at the forefront of globalization. We will attract the best from all over the world, and you as an Emirati have to compete with them. And we're going to give you certain advantages just by virtue of your nationality. Don't use that as a crutch. Use that as something that will then propel you forward. I think national service, the 1.5 years of military service for men, is part of the way to remedying that, to giving these kids a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of also of responsibility. But it's probably going to have to, they're really going to have to ratchet this up to give more skills-based training rather than just pure military discipline. Over to you, Dr. Jarrar.
Well, thanks for the thinking time. It wasn't enough, so I didn't have. So look, I think nationalism across the whole world is going to ratchet up a little bit, and this is a cyclical nature of economics. I'm not an anthropologist, but I can tell you, when the economy is brilliant and everybody has a great job and everybody's making money, you very rarely hear about, why is he in my country and why is somebody else, The US wouldn't have canceled H-1B1 visas if the economy was doing brilliantly and everybody had a job. So it is natural in any country in the world when there's economic pressure for people to start looking at who's taking our jobs, whether you're in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, whether you're in the US, whether you're in Australia. So that is going to go up globally by nature and by virtue of what we're going through now. And the question is, how long will this last? And is it actually realistic? I don't think it's right. I don't think it's a solution to anything. In fact, if you do take away everybody who we want to take away from every society to relieve the local population, so to speak, we would regret it. The UK will regret a lot of the immigrants, so to speak, leaving the UK because of that, and they will only find out a few years from now. So it's not a rational thought, it's much more of an emotional thought. And it's very hard to convince somebody who is a little bit hard up, who's not making ends meet or not meeting their economic dreams, and they see X, Y, or Z from a different country, sitting in their country and making lots of money, living the life and so on. So that will always cause that kind of tension. I think there's a big job for governments to explain the utility and the value of having such different populations. I think creating role models. It is very difficult to have these conversations in the GCC. I think the attractive part of the GCC, which is tax-free system, makes it also difficult to explain why somebody creating a company worth billions is good for us in the GCC, right? So they made billions. If we say if they paid 1/3 of that in taxes, I can see how that came back, got redistributed. If they haven't, then it makes it even harder to have this conversation. And that's why I say moving forward, the conversation is going to be very intermingled with long-term residencies versus utility of this for both the state, the nationals, and the expat. And this will have to introduce, nobody's going to like this from the 200 people following us. We have to start talking taxation. You know, you don't want to, you want to talk permanency, you want to talk longer term, you want to talk utility. You have to start giving back. And the first form of giving back and sort of redistribution is taxation. And that's a whole different, and so that will take us into a whole different level of discussion. So I think it is, again, not very simple saying nationalism in the GCC is rising or not rising because of what's happening now. It's a global thing. It's an economic situation thing. I've been in the UAE for 20 years. I've never felt out of place. Nobody ever reminded me that I was a non-Emirati or taking anybody's job. When we went through many crises, we went through 2008, 2014 oil crash. But now I've heard these conversations about, because this was a global situation. People couldn't physically go back to their countries. So in a way, COVID-19 is a force multiplier to a conversation we were starting to have. Remember, the UAE and Saudi said they will introduce long-term visas before this happened. It's been 2 years in the making. So we were starting to have this healthy conversation, thinking about the development model, building a step-by-step process. And I thought it was a 10-year journey. I told people, my friends in government, I said, now you start having the conversation. When I finished my tenure, right? Just about, I'm about to leave and you start having this conversation. But it was a healthy 10-year journey and we were heading in the right direction. COVID-19 was a force multiplier. It forced us to have a 10-year journey, have a conversation in 6 months. That's going to cause a lot of anxiety across the board. And I don't think we're going to solve it in the next 6 months, but we're probably going to take now 5 years to figure out some form of model. First responders, I don't think any Emirati doesn't want the doctors to stay longer. You'd shudder to think your family doctor might leave in the next 5 years. So it's going to be a mixed match. As I said, it's not a matter of when, it's going to be how, when, and for whom, and what form. But again, it's not citizenship. It's more of a permanency of a development model. And I see somebody saying tax is fair. So there you go. I've got one vote as well for the taxation system moving on.
To clarify, he said tax is fair if rights and resonate clear. I assume he's referring, to that quote, no taxation without representation, which, as you touched on, is a whole other subject, which...
you can't have the conversation about you're allowed to stay here forever without giving back to contribution. So I think it's linked. Such a complex system that it's so healthy that you guys are taking it on to start the debate. I think we're the first responders, Your Excellency, and Dr. Neha and Eman in this conversation. A brave conversation.
Certainly. Eman, Dr. Vora, would you like to respond to that before we move into the Q&A, formal Q&A, I guess?
I agree with Dr. Yasser and so many of the points he said. I think, of course, this nationalism we've seen everywhere else, but maybe what strikes me as unique in Saudi, for example, is that, of course, it's been quite, quite on the rise in the past few years. And when you hear hashtags or you see hashtags like As-Saudiya, Al-Saudiyin, then you realize that, this is going to be an issue. If you're going to think about all these different residencies and, as you said, of course, citizenship, which of course is a total different topic, as Dr. Yasser said. But of course, we have so many different issues that we're dealing with in these Gulf countries that I think we need to, figure out first before we have that other discussion, as you said.
Okay, then. Thank you, Eman. I don't think Dr. Vora wants to add any further points. So we currently have a total of 53 questions, which is incredible. we've earmarked a few to answer. I mean, there was one question on tax, but I feel that Dr. Jarrar has gotten into that, has covered that fairly extensively. I mean, the question was, if and when tax income eventuates in the region, will it change the need to provide a pathway to citizenship or more permanent residency, I guess. And I feel that, to basically, we would end up entering that discussion. Another question, an anonymous attendee asked, they would like to request every speaker to give their opinion on the risks associated with granting, sorry, we keep getting so many questions that it's hard to keep track. On the risks associated with granting more permanent forms of residency, if any.
I don't think there are any risks.
I think there's a lot of risks, to be honest. I think it's fraught with risks in the sense, and I talk from a country that sort of was over the last 50 years had many waves of people coming in and getting nationalized in Jordan, where I grew up. I think there's a lot of risks there. When you grant people permanency, you import a lot of the problems, at least for the first or two generations of where they come from. So you inherit a lot of that. I'm not going to even go into the issue of identity, but if you think of it as things of language, culture, a lot of this will change. Some people think this is a good thing. Some people think this is a bad thing. You can look at two countries like Singapore, who had a very long and heated debate about reimagining the Singaporean issue, culture, identity, language. So I think there's a lot of I would say intangible risks. I don't think there are hard risks, as in, I can only think of good economic benefits if the GCC becomes the real globalization melting pot with the rise of Asia. There's a lot of economic benefits. There's a lot of sustainable model benefits, assuming we weed out the labor market inefficiencies that we have. But when it comes to the intangible culture and social risks, I think it's a very, it's a full of landmines, this conversation. And I wouldn't rush into it. I would think of some sort of a longer term residency economic system, point-based, and that's a first step. And as I said, it's an experiment. There's nowhere else in the world where there's so many people living in a country that are non-nationals. So we don't have anything to fall back on. We don't have models in history or in geography to say, here's a good benchmark where it worked. Hence, it's an experiment, and it has to be taken slowly but surely with lots of deliberate thought. I thought we had a 10-year run to have this model ironed out.
Dr. Jarrar, could I ask you a question here? Just about removing the inefficiencies in the job market. Quite a lot of the heads of organizations will actually look at the local citizenry as part of the inefficiencies, and they would prefer quite often to bring in foreigners. How do you see that working?
Look, part of that is our inefficient minimum wage system, right? Because we can make jobs in Saudi attractive to Saudis if we have a minimum wage that is Saudi level, but our minimum wage is set to Asian level. So, so our minimum wage is distorted by the huge availability of Asia and Africa cheaper labor. And that
how about if you looked at the white collar workers?
And if in the white collar workers, okay, so in those areas, we don't have a corporate taxation system. So what other countries have done to introduce productivity, investment in technology, automation, was they use tax credits, they use tax incentives. No single factory in their right mind would automate a production line if they have an endless supply of people who would work for $10 a day. So we didn't have in our labor market the tools to raise productivity by way of minimum wage, by way of investment and technology. So our labor markets have grown over the decades, being fueled by extremely low-cost labor. Now, this gave us a competitive edge in some industries, in the industries where labor intensity was crucial. But as we move along, you've all heard the spiel about the fourth industrial revolution and future of work. That is not going to be a competitive edge for us anymore. So for us in the GCC to maintain this competitiveness, it is imperative to break down and invest in, but that will take away a lot of built wealthy conglomerates that are based on that model. And there's a bit of creative destruction needed over the next 10 years. Otherwise, we will become the sort of, we move from the Asian tigers to the Asian factory houses, like happened to some of them. And that's a different discussion. It's all not different. It's all linked together. But it's I think all of these discussions have to be had in the same breath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Vora, I believe you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I live in a country where immigration is a hot topic all of the time. And the kind of the people who are proponents of more regulation on immigration often bring up this question of like, you know, what are people going to be bringing over here? What about the culture? Is the culture going to get lost? What about our identity? I mean, the sheer fact of the matter, though, is that people are here, right? Just like in the UAE, people are there. Whether they have residency or they don't have residency, the problems in their countries come with them, right? And those are also, you know, global problems. So I don't really, I kind of find that to be like a false flag in certain kinds of ways, because the what ifs often take over like the more empirical sorts of conversations. I mean, right now we have a system where the majority of people that live in the UAE have tension about whether they can stay. They don't feel comfortable speaking their mind in their jobs. They might not feel comfortable in their relationship with their Emirati managers or co-workers, because they feel like their jobs are at stake if they actually like step across any kind of line. There's so much sort of like self-censorship and self-policing about, you know, what if I do this, will I lose my job? If I lose my job, then I get deported, right? And look at the sheer volume of problems that the country is having right now in terms of people who are living out of status right now because they can't leave the country because of COVID, or they lost their job and they're looking to find another one. If we actually had a system where it was easier to move between jobs, where your residency wasn't dependent on your job, you would actually have a much more prosperous society.
Eman, Your Excellency, do you have any further points?
Dr. Vora, for a moment, I felt you were describing my daily mental state. We too are not so secure in our jobs. I mean, I have to try very, very hard to make sure that my boss is happy with me. So, you know, it's not that straightforward to be Emirati. It's not that straightforward to be Saudi or Kuwaiti. There's not so much. I mean, I actually think this issue of precarity applies to all of us, not just to the foreign populations. True, we're not going to get deported, but you know, everything else.
Well, I mean, I can say certain things in the UAE that an Emirati citizen can't say. So these are things that are. This is why I'm saying we need to look at these as interconnected struggles, and not ones that are on one side or another. A really great researcher, Bob Vitalis, who has done work on what the American oil companies and British oil companies did in the Gulf. You know, they very purposefully separated nationals from foreign workers in the oil fields, because they knew that if you actually allowed people to talk to each other about their labor concerns, that they would organize, right? So I also kind of feel like, in whose interest is it to perpetuate this idea that if the foreigner gets something, the citizen loses something? I mean, I believe that's in the interest of the most elite, right? So maybe we need a different model about how can we work together to gain something together.
That's actually very, very interesting insight.
Okay, moving on. Dr. Jarrar, did you have something?
Just two very quick points. First of all, I think, and I can double check, the Ministry of Human Resources in the UAE has allowed people in these exceptional circumstances to jump jobs, and you can keep your visa. So I think the notion, maybe the mistaken notion that if you lose your job in this crisis, you will leave the country is not right. It's an exceptional circumstance. I want to also caution us as a panel and as listeners to not be too COVID-centric in this crisis. We are in the middle of a black plague kind of once in a generation crisis, a world war kind of crisis. And these are not the right times to set in systems and policies that would affect the next 30 years. So we shouldn't probably be reacting neither to the good stuff that is happening. And I'm very pleased to say that I have personally felt a lot of warmth, at least living in the UAE, from the leadership of the UAE and the whole society within this crisis. And there's a lot of rules that have been changed within the Ministry of Labor for this crisis. Some of these will go back to normal when this crisis is over. This conversation will be much healthier taking a 30-year view as opposed to in this crisis, this happens and how could we react to it? Because I don't think this is a normal crisis. It's not a financial crisis. This is a once in a generation crisis. So I'm just warning not to be too crisis centric versus long term. And if I was the government, I wouldn't want to do anything now to make anything either permanent or discourage people from thinking about it.
Dr. Vora, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think I'm good. Does Eman have anything to add?
Okay. Considering the sheer volume of questions we've received, and I know that you've all been looking at them, would you like to choose your own question to, yeah, because it's become exceedingly difficult for me to pick, and I'm, communicating with our committee, and it is quite difficult to deal with such a volume of questions. Is there anything which jumps out at you that you would like to address directly?
Well, I have a question for you, Khaleefa. Why did you choose this topic to start with?
We felt it would be, considering the time, considering the conditions, it was an extremely pertinent discussion. I mean, as I said, it kind of ties into a longer term trend. I mean, the whole issue of expat flights, keeping the expats, managing the longer term, the longer term issues. But now, especially with what the crisis has brought on, we felt that it would be a highly relevant discussion to have. And it has proven to be extremely popular based off, the number of sign-ups of attendees we've had. And I'd actually like to thank our audience for being very engaged. It shows that this isn't fluff. This is something which is extremely important to, the people who are attending, citizens, expatriates, who else? I mean, so yeah, that would be my response. But returning to my original question, I guess, are there any questions which the speakers would like to address directly, which have caught your eyes?
There is one that caught my eye where it suggests that I have equated between being non-Western educated with being underqualified. That wasn't the point I was making. I was worried that Emiratis who only speak Arabic and speak English, or speak English poorly, are not as welcome in the workforce and the higher levels of the workforce because they don't speak English, and because English has become the lingua franca of the Emirates and of business. So in that sense, I feel very strongly that they are being unfairly disadvantaged through the educational system. Culturally, they're not in an environment where they can learn English and speak it fluently. And the way the financial system works here and the business sector works here is that you got to speak English. That's all. Doesn't mean they're underqualified. It means that they are disadvantaged in a certain sense.
Again, Your Excellency, a global trend. A global trend.
Sure.
If you don't speak English anywhere, it's becoming, or maybe Mandarin in the future. But it's a global trend. I just want to make sure we don't sort of isolate our situation as unique. I think you're absolutely right. It's good. And I wanted to add a complication, Khaleefa, in the last moment.
Sure.
I saw some of the questions. Somebody said, they respectfully disagree. You can always disagree, and I'm very healthy discussion that the structural crises is a good time to make big changes. Structural crises like this, big shocks, whether you're a person or a company or a nation, are a great time to reflect and think. But making decisions when you're in the mental situation we are in now is not advisable. You are reacting, you're firefighting, sitting down and thinking how I can prevent future fires while you're holding a hose in the middle of the heat, inhaling the fumes, is not a good idea. So I respectfully double disagree with the person who asked the question. I think it's a great time to reflect. We should not let this situation go unnoticed. We should keep the lessons, but we don't make decisions now based on what's happening now. That would have implications for many generations to come. So I think we should absolutely take it in. Second thing, somebody asked, a good friend of mine, I think I saw the first name, I think it's Nafis, who said, how do you increase minimum wage in a time of economic crises? and oil price discussion. So, you know, if you increase the minimum wage, this recycles into the local economy. So you give people more purchasing power. The problem we have in the GCC now is people don't retain because of the remittance system. So this introduces another layer of complication. Should we introduce some sort of pension scheme where people actually put some money that is reinvested back through a pension system and not leave the money to completely go and build the future away and completely depart? We need to find more ways for this economic value to recycle here to the benefits of both sides. So that's my additional complication to say, you know, we haven't even started talking pensions, let alone visas and so on. It's a very complex discussion, but I'm very happy it's started. I think a lot of people seem to be at least positively thinking, thank you guys for the Emirati society in the Oxbridge for at least triggering this conversation, if nothing else. I'm not sure we reached the conclusion.
Your Excellency, but Dr. Vora, I believe you had something you wanted to answer, something you wanted to respond to.
Are you speaking to me? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to build off of Dr. Jarrar's point where, you know, like, and I don't know if you're necessarily making this point, but I want to kind of like push to make this point that, well, first of all, I can just tell you that all of the money is not leaving. Expatriates spend a whole lot of money in the Gulf on consumer items and have a lot of expenditure that happens in the Gulf. But what would it mean if expatriates actually had a greater stake in the societies that they live and work in? I think the only way to do that is to have some kind of legal attachment, right? The kind of putting money away for a house in India is a security measure because people feel like they are going to have to leave at a certain point. Maybe they wouldn't be putting that money away. Maybe they'd be putting it towards a house in Dubai.
Somewhat related to that, I guess, is one question we had, more specifically on the second generation of, you know, expatriate students within the UAE. Hamid Khan asked, given a dynamic free market, should expat students studying in the Gulf be given any preference over expat laborers or immigrants being brought in to fill in jobs? Would there be any advantage in, I mean, he writes that he finds it tricky to compete given the wages, you know, with people who are being brought in. But I do feel that, yeah, he's raised a very important issue on, you know, making the most of this second generation population who have grown up within this country, who have, in a way, a far more rooted understanding, I'd say. But, you know, the question's to all of you.
Well, from a competitiveness point of view and from a business owner point of view, as myself, I'm a business owner, I wouldn't want to give preference to anybody. I want to hire on meritocracy. So whether you studied in India, Jordan, Zayed University or anywhere, I want the best to work for me. So I don't think neither myself nor Emirates Airlines would want to hire anybody based on nationality or source of a degree. Having said that, I think the question that was asked has more to do with minimum wage than it has to do with actually where your degree is sourced. Because he said, or I think it was he, that, you know, maybe I can't compete with somebody who will accept a lesser wage because their point of reference, they can come here and save, and that money would translate into a bigger remittance. That's a minimum wage discussion, which is a bit distorted in our markets. And that has to be solved for in our markets. There's a lot of people who make big profits based on this distorted market. So it's going to take a long time to slowly but surely move out of that. I think productivity is the way. I think investment in technology might take away, technology in its wider sense with a big T, might take away a lot of these distortions, but it has to be enforced by policy. And in the absence of a taxation policy, we have to be very innovative to find some policies that would push into a much more productive labor market.
Yeah. Eman, is there anything you wanted to say?
Not on this issue specifically, but there is something that was mentioned just a while ago about language that I just wanted to touch upon a little bit. I mean, I live in Norway, and it's a country of 5 million people, and they expect you to speak Norwegian if you want to get a job. And Norwegian is, you know, it's only spoken by 5. Of course, if you speak it, you can understand Swedish and maybe a little Danish, but still, you know. So if you go to the workforce, you would definitely be asked, do you speak Norwegian? So I think in the Gulf, we usually say, of course, everyone has to speak English, but we don't expect anyone to speak Arabic. But it's quite interesting how in places like here, for example, no, you are expected to speak Norwegian. So I think it's something that we never think about in the Gulf.
Dr. Vora?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you. This has been really interesting.
I just wanted to make the point that, when I meet with expats, if I'm feeling comfortable enough, I will ask them, do you save? Can you save? And often the answer is, I really try, but I can't. But I think a lot of the money stays home. And I can't help thinking that a lot of businessmen have their eye on expat money in the first place.
One final thing before we move on to concluding statements. This is more from Rod Cowan. He's raised the issue of religion, or more specifically the fact that no one so far has addressed religion directly, except for, I think, His Excellency in talking about tolerance. How do you feel that is going to play into the discussion around state expatriate or society expatriate relations moving forward?
I'd like to just say a couple of words there. I actually know Rod, and I ignored his question on purpose. He must have put that question up there 4 times, perhaps even more. I actually don't think that it is an issue here. And I think that the great push is for people not to ask about your religion. For the government and for society not to be interested in your particular personal beliefs, but to allow you to continue, worshiping in the way you do. So I'm not sure it's as big an issue as some people think it is.
Eman, Dr. Vora?
I mean, I do feel like, when we're talking about certain divides in the national population, that we do see sometimes discourse that's about, this is not Islamic and therefore it's not Qatari, that this is a foreign thing that's coming in, and like kind of the way that we see a particular kind of Islamism coming along with a particular kind of nationalism, and then the kind of elite English educated citizenry that we've been talking about, I think it positions itself as a more secular group. So I think religion does come into play there. Definitely in the Indian diaspora, even though the majority of Indians that are in the Gulf are Hindus, there's a disproportionate amount of Muslims that come because they do want to be closer to, to Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula, and also because they feel like they're safer. India is a highly Islamophobic place.
Dr. Jarrar, anything you wanted to add?
Highly not my area of strength or expertise, but simply as a resident here who has friends from different nationalities and different regions, it's not something that came up. It's a very deep personal thing, and it affects the people's identity. But when it comes to labor force, immigration, I don't think it's something that is. I think it's the extreme opposite. I think we're very tolerant. It's a very, very tolerant society. Some people don't actually believe the openness here. So it's not something that I think came up in my lifetime here. But I'm not somebody who's observing these things. I quite prefer numbers, to be honest.
Sure. Okay, we're going to have to wrap this up fairly soon. Would the speakers like to make any concluding remarks, concluding statements?
I'll let His Excellency go first.
Great. Okay, I was going to say we're losing valuable temporal real estate. I'd like to say that it's been a really great pleasure to take part in this debate. I wish I'd been a bit better prepared. I didn't realize that there were going to be real experts on the panel. I thought this was going to be a friendly, student-led kind of discussion. So I've been warned. And thank you to the other panelists for really being brilliant and allowing me to shine occasionally.
I too would like to also thank everybody, and just like His Excellency said, I was the ambush because I didn't know Dr. Neha wrote books on the topic, so I took my comfort zone of competitiveness and the economic development. But look, I want to say that this topic, as sensitive as it is, many people saying it's a sensitive topic, it's not as sensitive as we think it is. If you look at the vision statements of Oman 2040, Saudi 2030, UAE, every single one of them touched on the topic, talked about longevity, talked about how to deal with expatriates. I think just this period of COVID made it feel like we are a society that I haven't seen anything in the last 20 years that reflects the conversation we were having around COVID. But, you know, any country in the world is having the same conversation. These are very unusual times. But I think it's a very, very healthy conversation that started way before this. And, you know, I think watch this space. I think in the next 5 years, we will see fundamental changes. I'd love to predict what they are, but I think fundamental changes are coming in a very measured and structural manner.
So I'd also like to thank fellow panelists. Thank you for the organizers. And also the questions have been really great. We have an amazing amount of attendees. I think at one point I saw over 200. I just kind of, you know, like, I hope this doesn't come across as like patronizing, it's not meant to, but like one of the things that I always do in my anthropology classes, and I did this when I taught in Qatar as well, is I have students go and do ethnographic research, which is basically interviewing and talking to people outside of their comfort zone. I really feel like if everybody who has an investment in the Gulf just took a moment to like talk to somebody outside of their comfort zone and try to see what the experiences are like from that person's perspective, whether it's someone of a different class status, different nationality, different time in the amount of time in the Gulf. I really think we would have a much more productive way to have these conversations that don't feel so sensitive and don't feel so, you know, segregated in terms of, I think our societies would become less segregated in that case.
Eman?
Yes, of course, I would also like to thank you and the Emirati Society for hosting this discussion and being with the other esteemed guests here. But even though Dr. Yasar said we shouldn't be COVID-centric, I think one of the good things about COVID is that we are having this discussion now about, you know, migrant workers and expats in general. And I'm very happy whenever I go on, you know, social media and I see lots of people in the Gulf talking about this almost every day, and especially in regard to migrant workers. You know, we see how people who are delivering goods, for example, and so on, you know, and they're wearing this face shield. You know, it's quite inhumane in this heat. So we've seen this, and I think it's raised a lot of awareness, and I think that's a very good thing. So it's good to see that. And again, you know, thank you all for this.
Okay, I guess that brings it to an end. Thank you to all our incredible speakers for having, you know, for being here today, for allowing us to have such an insightful discussion. There's no real way in which we could, you know, cover this entire topic within the full, you know, within 90 minutes. You know, clearly, kind of as Dr. Jarrar was saying, you know, everything is linked to something else, which in turn opens another discussion about something bigger. And before you know it, you know, we start talking about expatriation, and then before you know it, you're talking about issues around taxation, representation, and all else. I can see the number of attendees dropping down already, so I'd like to ask a question to our attendees who've made it this far, which is frankly an incredible amount. You know, I'd actually like to thank the audience for staying until the end. I guess you know, currently, our discussion is mainly focused on, you know, maybe the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 20. But I guess one thought experiment which would let everyone get very creative in, you know, imagining new possibilities would be to think about what is the end game to Gulf, you know, to state and society and expat relations within the Gulf? Where do you see this going in the far future? How do you see this ending up, I guess? I'm sure there's a better way to phrase that question, but I've come up with it on the spot. Please feel free to tweet at us, message us on Instagram, email us directly. We'd love to hear back from you. We'd love to hear, you know, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what was discussed, what you felt should have been discussed, what we missed out, what we can improve on. And indeed, just, we'd like to hear, your thoughts on the debate. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to the speakers for attending today, and have a wonderful evening. And inshallah, this will be the first of many, many, many discussions we'll be having.
Thank you.
Thank you, Khaleefa.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.